Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be joined by a digital activist to find out how charities can make use of open data in everything from campaigning to fundraising.
But first, as we're recording this episode, the court system is whirring into action to fast-track prosecutions of those involved in the recent rashes of racist and Islamophobic riots in towns and cities across the country. Almost 800 people have been arrested and some 350 have been charged so far. But what about the broader response needed to tackle the root causes of this violence in our society? And what role can and should the voluntary sector play? As occurred in the wake of George Floyd's murder in May 2020 at the hands of a white police officer in the United States, there have been numerous statements from voluntary sector leaders condemning the violence and expressing solidarity with affected communities. And the sector has been praised by the government for its leading role in community-level response efforts. But what more needs to happen for meaningful, lasting change to be realised?
We're joined by Zoe Amar, founder and director of Zoe Amar Digital, who wrote an excellent piece for Third Sector last week about how the riots should represent a turning point in how the voluntary sector fights racism. Hello, Zoe. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Anj Handa, founder of Inspiring Women Changemakers, an organisation which works to make the world a safer, fairer place for women. Hi, Anj.
Hi there.
Now, just to start, Zoe, you described in your piece last week this moment as a test for the voluntary sector. Could you tell us why?
Absolutely. So, as you said, we have clearly seen a lot of condemnation of the riots and the racist and Islamophobic violence we've seen across the UK, and it is positive to see that. And obviously, it's reassuring also, as you mentioned earlier, to see that this swift action has been taken by government and the police. However, having spoken to many people of colour across the sector since the riots, many of them do not feel safe. And I think that's because there is a sense that this isn't over. Keir Starmer himself has said that the police need to be on high alert. Hope Not Hate have called this the most widespread outbreak of far-right violence in the post-war period. And yes, we know this has been perpetuated by a minority of people, but the scale is still in the thousands, and the size of it across the UK and the violence of it is really shocking, and a realisation that what the threat of the far-right really means to Britain and to the sector as well in 2024. And that is what is making people of colour working in the sector and in the communities most impacted by the riots feel unsafe. So I think in some way we have to acknowledge this within the sector, within our organisations, but also in a more joined up way across the sector. And for me, that means understanding that it's not a short-term crisis response. It's a long-term piece of work. And this needs to be reflected in the messaging and the action that's taken and driven by charity leaders, and also how the sector comes together to collaborate on the longer-term response as well. And then the second thing, again, from speaking to a lot of people of colour over the last week, is that there's a really strong feeling that people want to see action. So, Lucinda, you mentioned there that there was a lot of condemnation in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. But there's a sense amongst a lot of the people of colour that I speak to that these public condemnations didn't always translate into meaningful action. And that's really spelled out by the data that I mentioned in my article around how we haven't yet seen the full impact of that work across the sector. And so an example of a really nice piece of action that I saw last week was a LinkedIn post from Claw Social Leadership, who have condemned the riots but have straight away moved to running sessions for those most affected by the riots, which will be facilitated by coaches to provide support. And that's a really good tangible example of where charities can use their convening power to bring people together and support them and move from condemnation to action really quickly.
And I guess just picking up on that point, Anj, what advice do you have for charity leaders in terms of support for staff, volunteers, trustees, and even service users?
Policies are a good starting point, but really this is all about people relations and how you check in with your staff, with your trustees, with your volunteers, and other stakeholder groups as well. Do bring in your board where you can to help you. I see that a lot of charity leaders are burnt out at the best of times. So, how can you get support from others? If you have managers or other supervisors, bring them in, make sure that you are being supported by them and they're given the right language. And it is about the personal touch rather than issuing bland statements. Don't forget that your trustees are unpaid volunteers. So if you have racially diverse trustees, then make sure that you check in with them too.
What are your thoughts, Anj, on the role of funders and what role they can play in this process of response and meaningful action?
The IVAR principles are a great set of principles for any funder. They're a set of principles that were developed by the funding sector itself to lead to lighter reporting, things like unrestricted funding, participatory grant making, and so on. I'll give you an example of one of my clients, Smallwood Trust. They're a smaller funder, so can be more agile and responsive. The board and the team contacted all of their grant partners, and not only did they check in to ask how they were, they took some insights from them to shape their response. Their support took the form of help for grant partners that were directly affected, such as grassroots organisations in Middlesbrough who received some small grants to support their work in the coming weeks, and also about what they will do going forward. And what the IVAR principles do is they encourage funders to think about how they can lighten reporting, and particularly at times like this where organisations who are stretched don't have to think about responding and reporting to their funders. Offer introductions, offer other forms of support such as well-being support and non-financial support. What I see is that clinical supervision is needed within the sector, but many can't afford it. What could you support and fund there? And also it's about recognising the root causes and how you can address them with those things within your own organisation, but also fund the organisations that are set up to tackle the root causes. Other things that funders can do, and this is part of your longer term strategy, are looking at how you shift power at board level, within the teams, and within your grant making as well. So those are just a few of the things that grant funders can do. Of course, it's a long and ongoing process, and they will need to consider how that fits in line with their other strategic objectives, because all of these things will need resourcing in some way.
And Zoe, obviously we saw the role that social media played in fueling the riots initially. I just wondered what thoughts you had on how charities might monitor or even amend their use of social media going forward.
It's a really good point, because lots of charities have been asking me over the last week about what they should do about X, formerly known as Twitter. And those questions have been coming for a while, but they've really been exacerbated by what's happened. And I think in particular with X, it is a toxic space. It was used to mobilise people who were committing some of the acts of violence that we have seen over the last week. But it's also somewhere that's really hard to leave if your charity is a campaigning organisation, because we know it still has traction with politicians and the media. So now might be a time to do a risk assessment around that. And I'd say to any charity, with all of your social platforms, look at where you might be, how you can moderate your use to have a bit of a diverse portfolio of platforms, and to try and get people onto your own platforms as well, such as your newsletter. And above all, I think we all need to be prepared. If you think there is a risk that your charity could be targeted by the far right, look at how you can get a plan in place for that, and also make plans to protect your staff and your volunteers who are manning the channels, who are on your digital front line.
Some great thoughts there. Zoe and Anj, thank you both so much for joining us. And please do read Zoe's brilliant piece on the Third Sector website. Moving on to this week's main feature. We're here to talk about the importance of open data to the voluntary sector. And we're delighted to be joined from Vienna by Nathan Coyle, a digital activist, self-proclaimed civic disruptor, and senior peace tech advisor at the Austrian Centre for Peace. And he's recently written a book, Open Data for Everybody, Using Open Data for Social Good. Hi, Nathan.
Hello from Vienna. It's very nice to speak to you guys.
Well, it's great to speak to you too, and I've decided not to attempt an introduction to this very important topic because I think it would be better to get the basics from you to start us off. So please tell me, what is open data?
Well, open data is information that is freely available for the public use to redistribute without any restrictions. But open data is actually the name of the license, and it can't be called open data unless you license it as such. When people talk about open data, they try to overcomplicate it, but essentially open data is just documents you can download, spreadsheets, as long as something that is machine readable and human readable. And what I mean by machine readable is a piece of data, an Excel sheet or whatever that you download to your computer that then your computer can read. And human readable means, yes, we can download something and we can read it with our bare eyes.
And in what ways can this be useful to charities?
Open data is amazing for capacity building, funding. It's a great way to find evidence to base your tenders on, campaigning, making sure that your social issue is at the front and centre of your campaign, and also influencing decisions. But the problem is that many third sector and charities won't seek out open data because of its highly corporate image, and third sector would look at open data and not think it's for them. Or it is for them. It really is for them, because you can do so much amazing things with open data and it doesn't need to be corporate.
So let's go into some practical ways of using it then. You mentioned a list of different charity functions earlier on. Let's start with campaigning and influencing. If somebody's listening to this and they want to employ open data in their campaigning or influencing work, how can they do it?
There are loads of data sources out there. So if you're an activist and you want to go out there and find data now, your first stop should be local councils. So your local council will have lots of data already, anything from deprivation to water supply to your trash. You will find the same stuff at data.uk. There are also different specialised sources in the UK. So you can look at Shelter, for example, for social housing and deprivation. You can look at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for social justice data. You have data.police.uk, where there is so much data there already. But a little tip, if you go to police.uk and you go into your area section and put in your postcode, it visualises the data already for you, so you can use it as a good basis. And 360 Giving, which I'm sure that a lot of your listeners will be very aware of, they have loads of fantastic data you can use for grant making and formulating decisions for tendering. But you're lucky, other parts of the world do not have this. I can give you a very short story that fairly recently, or 2 years ago, I was working in Albania, and I was working on how we can make open data more accessible in different countries. And this activist was in the room and was like, oh, this is fantastic, oh, this is really well and good, like it's really great to learn about open data, etc. But we don't even have trains, we don't even have an impetus from government to give us data, let alone get us from A to B. So why does this matter? And then my attention kind of turned to, well, how do we get activists to make data open, and how do we help third sector in order to create their own communities around data? And that actually went on to formulate a lot of the research from the book.
You mentioned in your previous article about 360 Giving and how funders might use open data. Could you talk a little bit about how charities themselves might use it in order to make their funding applications more effective?
So you have something called crisis text line. Basically, it's something that people can ring in or speak to when they're in crisis, and they have used open data to identify the patterns of what they should fund. So they use NHS data, they use local government data to allocate resources of where they think it should be. And then basing that, so when they're going to funders, because they are core funded, as most third sector organisations are, they can evidence that, hey, this is where your money is being spent, and this is how we've quantified that information. The one thing that I've always told people when it comes to open data, especially using it for fundraising, is don't overcomplicate it. For the most part, a funding tender is an argument, and if you can't argue with the data, then hopefully you'd win that argument. So there's one example of how you can use data. It's actually limitless, and again, from the UK, you have a lot more in your arsenal than other people have across Europe and the world, indeed the world. You have data, everything from healthcare data to environmental data, police data. It's all at your fingertips. The only thing that people really need to grasp is to not overcomplicate the situation, not overcomplicate looking at the data. The evidence is there. So there's one example of how charities can use open data. And I do want to give an example of a case study from a book, Open Data for Everybody. I was working in North Macedonia a couple of years ago, and I was doing some workshops there, and I met some people from a project called Skopje 2014. Now, in Skopje 2014, there was a political crisis in the country. It was mired with corruption. A nationalist government built hundreds of statues around the city in an attempt to install national pride in the area. And it's one of the most weird and baffling things you'll ever see in your life. It's like walking around Las Vegas. It's really weird. But what happened was he promised the state that he would spend 20 million euros. It ended up being nearly 300 million, if I remember correctly. And all this was covered up. The whole corruption thing was covered up. 3 organisations were siphoning money. The government was making money on the side, until a bunch of journalists got hold of all of the data and then made it open data and then turned it into a project called Skopje 2014. If you Google it, you will find it. They created an interactive map. They told people exactly where their money was spent, who got the money from the government, where it all went, on this really lovely interactive map. Then what happened was something called the Colourful Revolution. Young people across the country descended on Skopje to show that, hey, we're not going to have this. And then they paint bombed all of these lovely marble white buildings. So that's a really example of how open data can install change, because after that, the president fled the country, but that was how citizens really implemented change, just by using a bunch of zeros and ones. I think that's really powerful, and I think messages like that really need to cipher down to people, because, again, I don't want to keep banging on about how something that's so corporate can have such a damage on outreach. But if you can just remove that, the sky's your limit, basically, and especially from a UK perspective. There's so much out there. There's so much you can do with open data. Just forget about all the rubbish and start using it.
Yeah, inspiring talk. And how about charities who have interesting data sets of their own? How can they contribute to open data sources, and why is it important that they do that work?
Well, for one, releasing data demonstrates that you're open for collaboration. You're showing people that you are open to work with people because you're putting their information out there. It attracts funding. Funders love the fact if you can collect data and you can evidence that you can sample very, very strongly, they love that. And I know that the National Lottery, for example, I did some work with them in the past. They love to see organisations who are actively sharing their data with other people, because it shows, a lot of tender partnerships are based on trust. And so it's really important, I think, to release data to show that you are open for these partnerships. Expertise. So different third sector organisations and different charities with sometimes a lot of hard to reach people with very different social issues, and it showcases that you are here, you are there, you're working with these people, you have access to these people, and you can build communities. And then it can showcase the diverse initiatives that you work on and showcase how you can bring people on board. When people talk about releasing open data, they think it's quite complicated, but it's not at all. In my book, what I tried to do was to make the whole idea around open data understandable and clear, including releasing data, because when I first started working in the third sector, I think the idea of releasing data is absolutely bloody terrifying. But it's not, it's really simple, and there's some steps you can follow to do that. So the first step is you have a data set. This could be a spreadsheet full of surveyed information. First of all, you need to clean that data. You need to remove all the identifiable things of your people that you work with. You need to make sure that your data is cleaned, dated, it's up to date. Then you choose your format. Now, I would always go against having it just human readable. So you'd see a lot of open data or PDFs, and that's great. Like, I can download a PDF, then I can read it, then I can maybe use that information for a report. But I can't really make anything with it. With a spreadsheet, you can make a lot more with it. I know it's naughty and you shouldn't do it, but you can just copy and paste that into something like ChatGPT, and that will give you back a detailed report already and basis of a funding report on there. Third, then you need to choose your license. So there are a couple of different licenses out there at the moment. So you have the Open Data license, which is from the Open Knowledge Foundation. That's very accessible, very easy to use. It's all free. And there's also Creative Commons. And I'm sure that people out there would know what Creative Commons is. They have a very comprehensive legal framework, and everything is protected for you. And that's basically the whole point of having a license. And then publish it. So, you can either publish it on your own website. There's no rules to say that you have to publish it in a certain place. Or you can publish it on something called CKAN. CKAN. Again, it's an open source platform.
And then for charities or people working for charities who are listening to this and think, I want to make better use of data in my work, from whatever side that might be, but are not sure exactly where to start. You've already mentioned some places where you can find really strong, solid open data sets. But if you want to learn a bit more about how to make use of it, where to get started, how to find it, all the rest of it, are there any useful resources online, for example, that you could point people towards?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Lucinda, because this new book has just come out. I don't know if you've heard of it. You have the Open Data Institute have a lot of resources you can use. Open Knowledge Foundation, who is one of my most favourite dear organisations in the world. Here in Austria, we're setting up a innovation hub for peace technology to make it more human-centric and community building called the Open Peace Tech Hub. And I'm working with the Open Knowledge Foundation to come on as a supporter because of the work that they do. Look at those. There's loads of resources there. They will tell you all about the open source tools you can use to use open data as well. And there are also different third sector organisations out there who are completely not for profit. There is Open Data Days. They have something called Open Data Manchester. It's really cool. There is the West Midlands Open Data Forum, which is really good.
Great. Well, that is a really helpful list, and we will do our best to include links to all of those that you've mentioned in the show notes to this episode.
How might this be applicable for small charities? Some of our listeners might think, well, that's all well and good if you're a big organisation with hundreds of staff and you've got people devoted to this. Is it something that small charities can get into, and if so, how?
So again, this is why I wrote the book, because coming from a disadvantaged background, and we depended on charities, small charities, food banks, whatever. I used to work a lot, for example, with presidents of residents associations. They're about as small third sector as you can possibly get, right? And all of these people would depend on funding from local government. How can they go about and improve their services, and etc., etc. Now, open data is for them. When the local authority comes to you and says, we have X amount of money, can you do something with it? What can you do? You can give them a whole plethora of things that you can do in the community. So there's so much data on data.gov.uk. If there's not enough housing being built and that the houses aren't in a certain area, you can heat map where the need is more in your area. The whole book is about trying to get tiny organisations, small organisations, to use data for capacity building, because organisations need to be far more smart these days, and it's heartbreaking because there's not enough money going around. There's not enough money. Organisations need to be more streamlined and smart, and using stuff like open data for the capacity building that we've talked about in this episode, the basis for campaigning, the basis for evidence for funding, etc. It's amazing and it needs to be used more.
Well, that seems like a great note to end it on. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, guys. It was an absolute pleasure to be on the Third Sector podcast. Thank you so much for the invite.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Nathan. There'll be more data discussions on the Third Sector podcast in the coming weeks, when I'll be taking a look behind the scenes at a day in the life of a senior statistician at the Donkey Sanctuary. Do look out for that. But for this episode, that's it. We'll be back again next week. And in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch to provide suggestions for other topics you'd like us to cover, please do get in touch via our short listener survey. You can find the link to it in the show notes, and we greatly value your feedback. For now, thank you to our guests Zoe, Anj, and Nathan. Our producer this week is Till Owen.